Good morning. Welcome back to Lovebabz Lovetalk. We are up early, and this morning, the last day of Publishers, University Publishers Week. My last guest of the week is Diana Martha Lewis, and we're going to be talking about her book, Colored Insane. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm doing good. I have my kids in the basement, twins, 2-year-old twins and a 5-year-old. So I'm hoping they will be quiet while we're on.
Woo! You got your hands full. Well, that's a wonderful blessing. So, how you doing?
I'm doing good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm so glad to hear. Tell me about this book. I don't think anybody talks about mental illness and slavery, enslaved people, or any of that. Like, talk to me about your way to this book.
So I found my way to the book from a class that I took on Georgia lunatic asylum is what it was called in the period that I look at it. And I focused on a woman named Olivia in a paper, and she was a Black woman who was there in the 1890s. And all I had was really her patient records, just what they said about her in the ledgers. And so I really wanted to know more about her life and how she got to the asylum and just the broader context, the historical context that she lived in. And so from there, I started to look at other Black women in the asylum. And one of the things I noticed was that they were their records were there, but their voices were silent.
Mm.
And I wasn't satisfied with telling a story about mental illness without having Black people's voices a part of the conversation. So I looked to other places in the time period where I saw Black people talking in slave narratives, in their poetry, in their novels. And I realized that Black people have been talking about mental illness during the time all along. And we needed to include their stories as a part of the history of mental health, a part of the history of psychiatry. And it just is there everywhere in a way that I found surprising at first, but made total sense when you think about it.
Now, are you a psychiatrist or a psychologist?
I'm not. I actually am trained as a literary scholar. So I was trained, I'm a literary scholar who now thinks about health and medicine. And really what I bring to the table is the idea that you really can't talk about health and mental health without having multiple perspectives at the table. Because if we look back in history, when we only pay attention to what the psychiatrists have to say and the medical mental health professionals have to say, there's something missing. So during the 19th century, psychiatrists were saying that Black people were better off in slavery because it protected their mental health.
What?
Um, yes, that was their logic. Their logic was that it had an overall logic that exposure to civilization and really what we now call stress was impacting people's minds, even white people. But they said slaves, they didn't have to worry about the next day, they didn't have to worry about food, and they lived a simple lifestyle, so they were protected against mental illness. That was their logic. And so, if you just listen to the psychiatrist, you get that story. But if you listen to Black writers at the time, they are saying actually slavery is what's causing us to go insane. All of the separation from family, all of the violence, the sexual violence, all of the physical violence, all of those things were causing an extreme amount of mental distress among enslaved people. And so that is a historical lesson that you just can't talk about mental illness without talking about Black people's stories because you're going to miss some important things. So as a literary scholar, I bring that to the table.
Wow. So, what were you intending to um, become a health scholar too? Like, were you intending that?
No. Well, see, what happened was I had always thought about slavery. I was thinking about slavery. As a literary scholar of the 19th century, slave narratives were important to me. But then when I took this class, I took it with Mab Segrest, actually, a famous civil rights activist. And she, introduced me to the asylum, and I realized that the asylum was this other major institution that Black people went into. And so that surprised me. And I still was interested in narratives, so I was trying to tell the narratives around people, but I just didn't know that slavery wasn't the only institution. Mental health asylums were a reform movement. It was a major
Wow.
reform movement. Yes, it was they people fought for more humane care because people were locked up in jails, they were in basements, they were tied up, they were wandering the streets, they were beaten, they were, people were trying to do exorcisms on them. And so they had a pretty tough life. And so the asylum came about as a movement to improve the care for the mentally ill. And they felt like large asylums was the best place to do it, that the asylum itself. And so they built asylums all across the country. So that came out of a humanitarian fervor that was alongside slavery. The same people who were pro asylums were people who were for asylums were against slavery. And it was just another movement, another cause that they felt strongly about. And so everybody was talking about asylums and also prisons. Prisons also emerged at this time and were had a reformatory vision that they could make society better. And so yes, the same individuals were concerned about all of these issues.
It's very interesting, Dinah, because we don't we we don't talk about asylum. Like, are there still asylums to this day? I mean, I know there's
Well,
like mental institutions.
yeah, so in the 20th century, mid 20th century, first with Kennedy, who had a sister who had mental disabilities, he talked about making mental health care more in the community rather than asylums. So there was a period of decentralization when we really decided as a society that asylums weren't the best way to treat people because asylums started off with a beautiful vision, right, of humanitarian uh, vision, but they ended up being overcrowded and rife with mistreatment, and people were understaffed and underpaid, and so they became these horrible places. And so in the mid 19th 20th century, they decided to go to community care. The problem with that transition was that it wasn't funded and supported at the level that it needed to be, and so most people with mental illness ended up homeless, and now the most psychiatric beds are in prisons. So
Mm.
we kind of left asylums as this place that you know dealt with mental illness to not having anything adequate to take its place, and now prisons are the new institutions. So that
Wow.
is the kind of like legacy of asylums.
And so, how would Black people, enslaved people, how would people end up in asylums? Would somebody walk them there, or
Interesting.
were they captured? Like, did they end up in these places?
So interestingly enough, during slavery, most Black people couldn't get into asylums because they didn't accept them. They
Oh.
they didn't allow them. So a lot of times people were treated on plantations. A lot of people went to conjure doctors to conjure women and men who treated them and tried to treat it in ways that the psychiatrists didn't really attend into the spiritual nature of mental illness, what they thought was the spiritual nature. But Black people couldn't get in. And in fact, Black leaders wanted people to be able to have access to the asylum. So even though they were bad places, they wanted inclusion and they wanted their people, their family members to be treated the same way, the same standard of care, what was the best standard of care for white people at the time. And so a lot of people got into asylums because of their family members, but what happened with Black women in the 19th century is a lot of them were deemed to be violent, and because they were violent, they were more likely to end up in an asylum. And so, they also ended up being arrested by police officers and tried before judges or went before judges and then found themselves in the asylum. So there were many paths to the asylum, but some of them, just like today, are sympathetic family members who just don't know what to do and are looking for some kind of reprieve and look to psychiatry as a place that they could get help for their loved ones.
Wow. So this is all very fascinating. And so, and you say asylums thrive for how long?
Well, up into the 1960s and 70s, it's when they really started, decentralization started coming about during the Carter administration. A lot of community health centers were being built, but again, they were not funded. So it really was President Kennedy who first decided to fund mental health facilities. And it was a matching system where they encourage states to support building community mental health, but you know it just didn't happen in that way. The funding didn't wasn't there.
Mm-hmm. And so, in these early days of asylums and enslaved Africans, and I mean, that just sounds like another uh, way to cut people off from family.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the it's funny. I don't want to necessarily get into all of it, but we're back at a place now where we're considering asylums. There was an executive order urging states to reopen asylums as a way to deal with mostly the homeless population. And so we're back at a place where we're thinking about asylums. But in the 19th century, these were places where I think people, you know, they felt that they could make a difference in people's lives,
Mm-hmm.
and they whether even though they thought that the psychiatrists and the slave masters and all those people said that mental illness wasn't prevalent among enslaved people. It was. They did have enslaved people who had mental illnesses. A lot of it came again from slavery. So, this was the way in which people addressed it.
Wow, that is, I don't think I would have ever thought about mental health asylums or mental health and enslavement in quite this way. I mean, I, as a learned person, I feel like, of course, um, uh, the Middle Passage was stressful. Of course, all of this was stressful, and then that's the end all for me. But so to come across your book and talking about this, and you said authors of the day and poets and writers of the day were talking about this all along.
Yes, they were. And not only authors, so there were also, people, particularly one man in particular, James McCune Smith, who was a medical doctor. And he was a man of medicine, at first African American, educated Black doctor. He worked out of New York. He treated both white patients and Black patients, some of whom had mental illness. He ran an orphan asylum as well. But one of the things he did was really speak back to the conclusions they were making about Black mental capacity. The psychiatrists and physicians alike thought that Black people were physically and mentally inferior. That was a part of their conversation when it came to psychiatry. But people like James McCune Smith were publishing research papers, doing case studies. He was doing speeches where he was really trying to break down and push back on psychiatric thought. And like I said, he's a man of medicine. He was kind of challenging it from the inside, where somebody like Frederick Douglass was making speeches where he was declaring that Black people were not mentally inferior. Somebody like James McCune Smith was publishing research, volumes of research to push back. And so you have both the more artistic polemical figures like Frederick Douglass, but then you had James McCune Smith, who all were really against the conclusions that were made from, of course, the beginning of our country, from the time of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was the first person, our national hero was the first person to to start the question about whether there was differences, distinctions between black people and white people, and he did that on a physical and mental basis. And those ideas justified slavery, not just justified slavery, but after slavery, they justified some of the violence that came up against Black people, the Ku Klux Klan. Those kind of organizations were making claims that Black people were mentally inferior and they were refused to be, quote unquote, dominated by the Negro race, an inferior race. So we see this language is not just neutral. The language was a part of real systems of violence to justify it and to perpetuate it.
Wow, that is so fascinating. That adds a whole additional dimension to slavery to me. It adds
Yeah,
a whole other
definitely.
dimension.
You cannot think about slavery without thinking about the physical and mental toll that it was taking. Many slave narrators were saying that the mental toll outweighed the physical toll. You look at somebody like Harriet Jacobs, and she's saying, my body was she devised a plan where she tried to escape from slavery by hiding in an attic to convince her slave master she was gone, with the hopes that he would sell her children, and he did. But in that cramped space, she was physically disabled because she stayed there for 7 years in a tiny attic space. But she also underwent extreme mental distress in that space, and she says that her body still suffers from those times in the attic. To say nothing of her soul, she describes the soul wounds as outlasting and being passed down from generation to generation. And so, well, for her, it was the immediate generation. She didn't see as far as we are today, but certainly she saw the generation after slavery still kind of dealing with the wound, because a lot of them came from family separations. After slavery ended, people were trying to, the first thing they were doing were trying to find their family members who had been stowed away, because they point to that as a deep wound. So you cannot talk about slavery and the violence of slavery without talking about the social, the emotional and psychological weight that it had on people.
Mm. So when you were doing your research, Diana, and you came across cases, particular cases of people who you knew to be black people,
Right.
African American people, what do those cases, narratives tell us?
Well, they were very formulaic in the asylum, so they usually recorded, people's. They noted that they were black by calling them colored, but they also noted their occupation, their age, whether they had children, whether or not they were violent or homicidal, just basic information about them. And they were very brief in the beginning. They were very brief ledgers. They were not as long as we see now with records. And so, they were just sketches of their lives. But what was absent from all of psychiatric documents was the violence that people were experiencing outside of slavery, were the burning of churches and the burning of schools, and the rise of, the victimization of African Americans. That didn't make it into the records at all, as a way to understand their mental health. So psychiatry really ignored it. And in fact, after slavery ended, they had a similar argument. They said, we're seeing so much mental illness. Black people are going into the asylum and at high rates because slavery ended. They no longer had the hygienic, quote, hygienic effects of slavery, uh, positive effects of slavery. And therefore, after slavery ended, they once again are experiencing mental illness, and that's why they're in asylums. Not the fact that they didn't allow Black people into asylums in the first place, right? So they're in there because they now have admission. But again, also not taking in the factors, the social and cultural factors that were informing Black mental health experiences during the time.
So, Diana, would they have men, women, and children, or were they separated out like different
Well,
asylums for different people, for different
so
sexes and ages.
Yeah, they separated people by, in general, asylums aim to separate people by gender, by diagnosis, even. So there were diagnoses like lunatic, which might map on the stuff that we see now as mood disorders like bipolar, schizophrenia. And then they had idiocy, which might be a cognitive disability like Down syndrome, and epileptics, which is actually maps onto what we now see as epilepsy, but then it was a mental illness. So they separated people by diagnosis, by gender, but when it came to Black people at Georgia Lunatic Asylum, they lumped them all together. So the kind of separation between Black white men and white women didn't happen. They were all in the colored building, and so that also was an overcrowded building where they had less access to resources, basic resources like bonnets and clothes, but also their nutrition was poor, and the buildings were more dilapidated, and so they fared worse in the asylum and didn't have, like, again, there were state of the art ideas about how asylums should be run, and the African American patients, because of segregation, didn't quite have access to the same level of care.
Wow. That is just fascinating. And the fact that the language that you found is now offensive language
Yes.
today.
Yes. Yeah. The language. So the book is called Colored Insane, and Colored Insane refers to both like a person, a noun as a noun. It's people with mental disabilities. And then as a verb, it's the ways in which people were made to be mentally ill, whether they were or not, and how these labels were ascribed to them, and how they were used to manage them and control them. But insanity as a term was a medical term. It was like mental illness, like what we see as mental illness. So it wasn't derogatory during the time. And we have to be careful because language changes over time. And what we now call mental illness might in 100 years be seen as derogatory. And so yes, that language was accepted, and Black people used the terms, and psychiatrists used it, and everyday people used it as well. It was kind of, they used it alongside the term mad. I use mostly in my book the term mental disability,
Hmm.
because disability is a way to both understand social processes that construct who is normal and who is not normal, and that occurs each generation. But it also leaves room for the ways in which people have physiological, biological disease, and it makes room for both how people are constructed as mentally ill, and their actual conditions. So mental disability is the term we use now, and disability studies tries to be careful about terms and always put them in the context.
So, what was the most surprising thing in your discovery? Like, what made you go, what the?
Well, there was a surprise in a good way. I have a chapter about Harriet Tubman. So
Mm,
Harriet Tubman is the most well-known Black woman in history. Everybody learns about Harriet Tubman, everyday people. But Harriet Tubman had a disability. She had what we now call temporal lobe epilepsy. So the most famous Black woman in history is also a disabled Black woman. And in her time, her disability was considered a mental disability. And so it takes a whole new light at how Tubman was considered during the time. Her first husband thought she was mentally ill. Her slave master thought she was, and felt like he couldn't sell her. And her friends, her activist friends, were always defending her sanity. And so there was a real question about whether or not she was actually insane. And a lot of it was connected to her religious expression, and the kind of symptoms that came along with a head injury that she got. And she had visions, and she would black out and lose consciousness. And she had foretellings, and she had dreams, and that kind of spiritual nature informed her life. But that was considered by psychiatrists the markers of insanity, that they thought that was crazy. What's wonderful about Harriet Tubman is she took the very things that they tried to pathologize her about and turned it into her superpower. It was instrumental to her activism, the work she did on the Underground Railroad, and also in the Army, and lastly in her home, the Harriet Tubman home. People might not know that, but she thought that was her greatest venture at the end of her life. She created this home where she treated people with all kinds of mental and physical disabilities and people who were aging and poor. And it was a small scale operation. These asylums were big and overcrowded, but Tubman pulled the little resources she had together to take care of the people who were most vulnerable in her community. So Tubman's life is just wonderful. She gets disabled, mentally disabled. People thought by this head injury, this physical injury, but then she incorporates all of that into her life. And so I think what we learned too from her is that you can't also talk about Black mental health without thinking about spirituality, because it figured so importantly into her life, and also kept her sane, along, with, or that's what she used it as. And so I think that a lesson for today is to think about people as whole people, as not only like thinking about their spirituality, but their spiritual nature, their spiritual being, as a way to inform their mental health, and as a resource, not as like, you either pray or you take pills, but you might need to do both. And
Mm-hmm.
so Tubman's story kind of brings out those dimensions.
So Dinah, when you were doing this work and you look at this now, do you see the threads of then and now and where we are in the state of mental health application, particularly in our communities?
Yes, I think one of the places we see it is that these ideas might still be showing up in psychiatry. So I was a part of a research study at
Wow.
the University of Michigan where Black women, perinatal and postnatal women, were talking about their symptoms to doctors the same as white women, but they were being diagnosed at a lower rate for mood disorders. And so essentially, Black and white women were both saying that we're experiencing, sadness, depression, things like that. But the doctors were not quite seeing the Black women's pain and suffering. And so there was a gap. And a lot of that gap is tied to the ways in which medicine doesn't fully acknowledge Black women's pain, doesn't fully see Black women. And so they can't actually help them. And so we still see the remnants of how archetypes about Black women are showing up. And then we also see certain kinds of things like postpartum depression not being diagnosed at the same rates as white women, because it's showing up differently in Black women. Often it shows up as anger versus sadness. And so again, they are not seen. And so the mental health field still has a lot of work to do to fully meet the needs of Black women, and Black people in general. It needs to be more culturally responsive, and also meet people where they are. So yes.
Hmm. And I think to that end, Dinah, do we have enough Black professionals in the? Do we have enough Black therapists and psychiatrists, folks in the field now?
No, we don't. We don't. There are very few numbers, percentages, low percentages of Black psychiatrists and mental health professionals. I think in general we need more mental health professionals. It's something like 1 in 4 people want mental health services but can't receive them, and so we have a real issue with the system in general. But there are even fewer people, even fewer Black doctors who really can understand the patients that come in that are Black, not only Black but also other, Latinx people. Native Americans have some of the highest rates of mental illness in the country, and it goes untreated, and so a lot of communities of color, even poor whites who have less access, especially rural ones who have less access to transportation. All of these groups are affected by lower access to healthcare, and then lower access to people who are like them, who come from their communities. And so we do still have a problem there.
Mm. All right. So So you've done the research and you're talking about this book. You're talking about this. Where do you want this book to land? I mean, I know it's a university press book, like it's an
Right.
academic book,
Yeah.
but where do you want to see this land?
Well, I really, this is an academic book, but I consider myself a Black feminist. I was trained as an Africana Studies scholar, and I really want to change the discourse about the fact that Black people think of mental illness as, in terms of stigma, and in terms of silence, right? We say, well, Black people don't talk about it, it's stigma more, and sometimes they think it's more stigmatized in our community. And I really want to erase that narrative. Black people do talk about mental illness. They talk about it maybe in ways that don't reflect mainstream medicine and psychiatry and mental health professionals, but they have it as a part of their lexicon. They have it as a part of their daily lives. And we've been talking about it for a long time. What we need to do is start turning to those voices and see what we've been saying and see what kind of solutions and what kind of ideas come out of the way Black people talk about it, because that is one of the sources of solving the problems.
Wow, that is okay. So, do you continue writing about mental illness in enslaved times, or do you? What's the next step for you?
Well, I do have those projects where I'm going to be continuing to see myself partnering with people in the medical profession to do research around Black women. Now, that's something I'll do. But in the period, I'm going to turn to Black women's ideas. Black women, I focus a lot on their experiences in my book, but I want to focus a lot more on how they thought about health and seeing what we now think of as maybe prototypical feminist figures, but seeing them as thinkers around health. And I really want to know what Black women have to say during this period. I'm already starting to see very interesting things. They are talking about things like rest and sleep
Mm,
really early on, right after slavery. They're thinking about repairing and healing, and really just seeing themselves as fully human. And so I think that's a moment where I want to pause on. I want to think about people like Pauline Hopkins and Frances Harper, even Ida B. Wells. I want to return to them, not just as like figures that we have to remember, but I want to turn to what they had to say. I think Black women in that period and now have a lot to say about the world and have some significant contributions to health in particular.
wow. Diana, Martha Lewis, I have enjoyed this conversation this morning. I have learned something that I did not know existed. So I want to thank you for that. And I so appreciate you getting up early with twins and a 5 year old to have this meaningful, rich conversation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it too. Thank you.
Well, you are welcome to come. Tell your people you're welcome to come back anytime you want to talk about anything.
Okay, okay. I definitely will come on and share with you and the people.
Thank you so much. Enjoy your weekend.
You too. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye. Colored Insane, that's her book. It's an academic book, but you can go get it. You want to read it, you want to know more about this. I'm sure you can pick it up at your local. You give local book folks can get their hands on it for you. So, thank you so much, Martha, Diana, Lewis. Yes. All right. Bye. Thank you, Harry.